Every morning at exactly 6:30 a.m., Margaret Ellis opened her curtains and let the pale winter light spill into her small living room in Ohio, United States. She was 78 years old, with neatly combed silver hair and a cardigan she wore no matter the season. The neighbors knew her as the sweet lady with the warm smile. At church on Sundays, she greeted everyone with soft laughter. At the grocery store, she always said, "I'm doing just fine, thank you." And she said it so convincingly that no one questioned it. Margaret had lived in the same modest house for 43 years. The paint on the porch was peeling now, and the wind slipped through cracks in the old windows. Once, the house had been loud, filled with her husband's deep baritone laugh and the quick footsteps of her two children racing down the hallway. But now, the only sound most days was the ticking of the kitchen clock. Her husband, Thomas, had passed away 8 years earlier after a quiet battle with heart disease. Her children lived in different states, busy with careers, grandchildren, mortgages, and deadlines. They called sometimes, not as often as they used to. Margaret told herself she understood. Still, evenings felt long, too long. She would sit in her recliner, holding a cup of tea long after it had gone cold, staring at the television without truly watching it. The silence in the house felt heavier at night, pressing against her chest. But if you asked her, she would smile. "I'm blessed," she would say. And no one saw the loneliness sitting beside her. At first, the changes were small, so small that even Margaret barely noticed them. She began waking up earlier than usual, not because she felt rested, but because sleep no longer held her the way it once had. At 3 or 4 in the morning, she would open her eyes to darkness and lie there, staring at the ceiling, her thoughts louder than the silence around her. Memories came uninvited. Thomas in the garden. Thomas reading the newspaper at the kitchen table. Thomas coughing in the hospital bed. She tried to push the images away, but they lingered like shadows. During the day, simple tasks began to feel exhausting. Folding laundry took longer. Cooking felt pointless when she was the only one at the table. Sometimes she skipped meals entirely, telling herself she just wasn't that hungry. Her church friends noticed she seemed quieter. "You okay, Margaret?" Mrs. Donnelly asked one Sunday after service. "Oh, I'm fine," she replied with that familiar smile. "Just didn't sleep much." But the truth was heavier than sleeplessness. Margaret had begun to feel something she couldn't quite name. It wasn't just sadness, it was a dull, constant emptiness, a feeling that the world was moving forward without her. She stopped answering phone calls some days, letting them ring until the house fell silent again. She told herself she would call back later. She rarely did. One afternoon, she stood in front of the bathroom mirror and studied her reflection. The woman looking back at her seemed smaller somehow, faded. "Don't be dramatic," she whispered to herself. After all, she had food, a home, children who loved her. What right did she have to feel this way? But depression doesn't ask for permission. It slips in quietly, especially when no one is looking. Winter arrived early that year in Ohio. Snow covered Margaret's porch in thick, quiet layers, sealing the world outside in white stillness. And inside her home, the silence deepened. Margaret began canceling plans. First, it was Bible study, then Sunday service, then the monthly senior luncheon at the community center. She told people she had a cold. The truth was harder to explain. Getting dressed felt overwhelming. Choosing clothes required energy she didn't have. Even brushing her hair seemed unnecessary when no one would truly see her. Days started blending together. Monday looked like Thursday. Morning felt no different than evening. She often forgot whether she had taken her medication. Sometimes she didn't care. Her appetite faded further. The refrigerator held leftovers that slowly spoiled. The trash can filled with untouched meals. One afternoon, her daughter Claire called. "Mom, you sound tired," Claire said gently. "Are you sure you're okay?" Margaret straightened her voice. "Oh, honey, I'm just getting older, that's all." Older. That word became her shield. But inside, something darker was growing. She began feeling like a burden, even though no one had said so. She imagined her children worrying about her, rearranging their lives for her, sacrificing their own happiness. The thoughts weren't loud, but they were persistent. "You're in the way. You've already lived your life. Everyone would be better off if you didn't need so much." One evening, as snow tapped softly against the windows, Margaret sat in her recliner and realized she hadn't spoken out loud all day, not a single word. Her chest tightened, not with pain, but with an unbearable heaviness. For the first time, she allowed herself to think it. This wasn't just loneliness. Something was wrong, and it was getting worse. The lowest point did not arrive with drama. There was no storm, no loud breakdown, no desperate cry for help. It came on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon. Margaret had not left the house in nearly 2 weeks. The snow outside had begun to melt, but inside, everything still felt frozen. She sat in her recliner, wearing the same cardigan she had slept in. The television was on, but the sound was muted. She stared at nothing. Her body felt heavy, as if gravity had quietly increased overnight. Even standing up required negotiation. "What's the point?" the thought whispered. She looked around the living room, the framed family photos, the worn couch, Thomas's old armchair that no one had touched in years. The house no longer felt like a home. It felt like a waiting room. Margaret slowly walked to the kitchen and opened a drawer. Inside were old documents, unpaid bills, and Thomas's medical papers. She stared at them for a long time. For the first time, her thoughts became dangerous. Not loud, not dramatic, just quiet and terrifying. If I disappeared, would anyone really notice right away? The idea didn't feel emotional. It felt practical, logical, as if she were solving a problem. Tears didn't come. That was the frightening part. There was no sadness left, only numbness. She lowered herself into a kitchen chair and placed her hands flat on the table. They trembled slightly, not from fear, but from exhaustion. "I'm so tired," she whispered into the empty room. Not tired from age, tired from carrying invisible weight alone. That evening she did something she had never done before. She turned off every light in the house before sunset, and she sat in the dark. Margaret didn't plan to ask for help. In fact, the next morning, she intended to do exactly what she had done the day before. Nothing. But life has a quiet way of interrupting even our darkest moments. At 9:17 a.m., her doorbell rang. She froze. No one ever came unannounced. The bell rang again, then a gentle knock. "Mrs. Ellis, it's Daniel from next door." Daniel was in his early 30s, a single father who had moved in the previous summer. Margaret had once baked cookies for his little daughter. That felt like a lifetime ago. She considered ignoring it, but something, perhaps curiosity, perhaps habit, pushed her to stand up. When she opened the door, cold air rushed in, along with the sight of Daniel holding a small grocery bag. "I noticed your trash hasn't been taken out in a while," he said carefully. "And your daughter called me. She couldn't reach you." Margaret's heart sank. Claire had noticed. "I'm fine," she began automatically, but the words felt fragile this time, thin, weak. Daniel didn't argue. He simply said, "My mom went through something similar after my dad passed. She said the hardest part was pretending she was okay." The sentence lingered in the air between them. Pretending. Margaret felt her throat tighten, not with pride this time, but with something cracking open. For months, she had told herself she was just tired, just aging, just adjusting. But hearing someone name it without judgment made the truth impossible to ignore. "I don't think I'm okay," she whispered. It was the first honest sentence she had spoken in a long time. Daniel didn't rush to fix her. He didn't offer grand advice. He simply stepped inside and said, "You don't have to go through this alone." And for the first time in months, Margaret didn't feel entirely invisible. Recovery did not begin with sunshine and sudden joy. It began with a doctor's appointment. Daniel helped Margaret schedule a visit with a local physician. Claire flew in from Chicago that weekend, her face tight with worry and guilt. Margaret noticed how tired her daughter looked, and for once, she didn't try to protect her from the truth. "I think I need help," Margaret said quietly in the examination room. The doctor listened carefully. He asked gentle but direct questions about sleep, appetite, thoughts, motivation. Words Margaret had been afraid to say out loud slowly formed into sentences. "Yes, I've felt hopeless. Yes, sometimes I don't see the point. Yes, I've thought about disappearing." There was no shock in the doctor's eyes, no judgment, just understanding. He explained that depression in older adults is common and often invisible. Grief, isolation, physical decline, life transitions, they pile up quietly, and sometimes the brain needs help the same way the heart or lungs do. Margaret began therapy. At first, she spoke very little during sessions. The counselor would wait patiently. Silence was no longer an enemy, it was a bridge. She also started medication, low dose, carefully monitored. The changes were subtle. She began eating small breakfasts again. She opened the curtains before noon. She answered Claire's calls instead of letting them ring. One afternoon, she found herself sitting in Thomas's old armchair. Instead of feeling swallowed by memory, she felt something gentler. Sadness, yes, but not emptiness. Grief was still there, but it no longer felt like a hole without a bottom. Recovery wasn't dramatic. It was a series of small decisions: to get dressed, to step outside, to speak honestly, to stay. And each small decision was a quiet act of courage. Spring arrived slowly in Ohio. The snow melted into soft patches of green, and sunlight began lingering a little longer each evening. Margaret noticed it one morning as she stood by the window. The light didn't feel harsh anymore. It felt warm. She still had difficult days. Recovery had not erased grief, nor had it turned her into the endlessly cheerful woman people once saw at church. But something inside her had shifted. She no longer pretended. On Sundays, when someone asked, "How are you, Margaret?" she sometimes answered honestly, "I'm taking it one day at a time." And that was enough. She returned to Bible study, not as the woman who had everything together, but as someone who understood struggle. When another elderly member quietly admitted she'd been feeling a little low, Margaret didn't offer cliches. she reached for her hand. "I've been there," she said softly. Her relationship with Claire deepened too. Their conversations were no longer polite updates about weather and doctor visits. They talked about fear, about loneliness, about aging, about what it means to still want to matter. Margaret began volunteering once a week at the local senior center, helping make phone calls to other homebound elderly residents. Sometimes, on the other end of the line, she heard the same pause she once carried in her own voice, and she would say gently, "You're not a burden, you're not invisible, and you're not alone." Behind her smile, there had once been depression, but now, behind her smile, there was honesty. And that honesty became her strength, because mental health does not disappear with age, loneliness does not discriminate, and healing, no matter how slow, is always possible when someone dares to say, "I'm not okay," and someone else answers, "You don't have to be alone."